On the morning of December 3rd, 1998, a 40-year-old woman named Julie Jensen was found dead in her bed by her husband. No obvious signs of trauma. No clear cause. A husband with a quiet, consistent story about a wife who had been sick for days. Detective Michael Jambois examined the bedroom where Julie Jensen was found, and something immediately stood out. The position of her body wasn't right. Julie's nose was damaged in a way that didn't fit simply being found in bed. One arm was twisted beneath her at an angle that looked unnatural. The initial autopsy came back inconclusive. There was nothing on paper to hold on to. Mark Jensen was questioned and released. He went home. The following day, a sealed envelope arrived at the Pleasant Prairie Police Department, hand-delivered by neighbors, who explained that Julie had given it to them weeks earlier with specific instructions. If anything ever happened to her, it was to go to the police immediately. Inside was a handwritten letter, signed by Julie Jensen, dated November 21st, 1998 at 7 o'clock in the morning. My name is Julie Jensen, and if anything happens to me, Mark Jensen should be my first suspect. I pray I'm wrong and nothing happens, but I am suspicious of Mark's suspicious behavior and fear for my early demise. I would never take my life because of my kids. They are everything to me. She had been dead for less than 24 hours. Her name was Julie Carol Griffin. She was 40 years old when she died, the mother of 2 sons, a woman who had chosen deliberately to step back from a professional career she was more than capable of sustaining because she wanted to be fully present for her children. She held a Series 7 financial license. She had worked as an administrative assistant at a brokerage firm. She had a professional identity separate from her marriage that she set aside not because she had to, but because she wanted to, on her own terms, for reasons that made sense to her. She was warm, engaged, and in the final weeks of her life, more clear-eyed about her own situation than anyone around her fully understood. She suspected her husband was trying to kill her, that she was in danger, and she spent those final weeks trying to make sure someone else would know it too. Julie Griffin grew up in Wisconsin as one of 6 children. She met Mark Jensen while both of them were working at a Sears. They dated through their college years, married in the spring of 1984, and settled into Pleasant Prairie, a village on the western shore of Lake Michigan, roughly 40 miles south of Milwaukee, the kind of upscale lakeside community that suggests everything in a life is going according to plan. Their house was a block from the lake. Mark built a career as a stockbroker, eventually rising to branch manager at a St. Louis-based financial firm's Racine office. He was, to the community of Pleasant Prairie, an ordinary man. A stockbroker, a churchgoer, a father. He coached sports. He showed up at school events. He presented the image of a family man embedded in a respectable suburban life, and nothing about that image required anyone looking in from the outside to look harder. When their first son David arrived in 1990, Julie made the deliberate decision to come home. Douglas came a few years later. Julie Jensen became, by the account of everyone who knew her, the center of that household. The school pickups, the dinners, the presents that children carry into adulthood. Her brothers Larry and Paul Griffin would later describe a woman who found her fullness in the daily rhythm of raising those boys. She called David and Douglas everything to her, and she meant it. That phrase would appear in her letter. It wasn't sentiment. It was the clearest possible statement of why she would never end her own life. The marriage had fractures beneath the surface. In the early 1990s, Julie had a brief affair with a coworker, a mistake she admitted to Mark, who said he forgave her. The forgiveness, if it ever existed, didn't hold. What replaced it was something quieter and more corrosive, a resentment Mark carried and occasionally surfaced in ways Julie noticed and documented. He held it over her. It became leverage. Then the harassment started. Hang-up calls to the house. Pornographic photographs left on the family's vehicles, in the garage, around the property. Pornographic material sent to Mark's office car in the parking lot. Julie reported it to police. Police investigated. Nobody was charged. Whether Julie knew or suspected who was behind it, the effect was to keep her off balance, frightened, and questioning her own perception of what was normal inside her marriage. By the late 1990s, Mark Jensen was not living the private life his wife believed he was. Investigators would later find what colleagues at his firm already knew, that Mark had been having an affair with a coworker named Kelly Labonte. The emails were on the family computer. They were explicit and ongoing. Two colleagues would later provide testimony that reframed the entire picture of what Mark Jensen was like behind closed doors. Kevin Nearing testified that Jensen had confided in him about the relationship with Labonte, and specifically that he had described Julie's old affair, the brief one from years ago, as a score he was still settling, not something he had forgiven and moved past. And then there was Ed Klug. Klug said that weeks before Julie died, he and Mark had been out for drinks when the conversation turned specific and disturbing. Mark had talked about his hatred for his wife. Then he had talked about methods, websites you could go to, substances that wouldn't show up in a normal autopsy, chemicals that crystallize inside a body after death. He had been explicit. He had been calm. He described it as something a person could do and get away with. Klug did not go to police at the time. Meanwhile, Julie Jensen wasn't waiting passively for something to happen. She had begun noticing things that frightened her. In Mark's datebook, she found handwritten entries that read drug supply and syringe. On one occasion, she came home to find the family computer still on, displaying a website about poisons. Their neighbor, Ted watched, urged her to document everything she was seeing. She did. She photographed the computer screen. She photographed the notes. She gathered every piece of evidence she could. And then, on a Saturday morning in November 1998, at 7 a.m., Julie sat down and began writing. She addressed the letter to whom it may concern, describing what she had seen, what she feared, and the one thing she needed investigators to know if anything happened to her. When she finished, she sealed it in an envelope and gave it to her neighbors. Ted and Margaret watched, with a simple instruction. If anything happened to her, they were to take it to the police. She went home. She made breakfast. She moved through the days of her ordinary, increasingly frightened life. In the final days of November 1998, Julie Jensen was ill. Mark would later tell police she had been struggling with breathing difficulties and weakness for several days. He had, just days before her death, arranged for her to be prescribed the antidepressant Paxil, telling doctors she was suffering from depression. He was building a picture, a depressed, fragile woman, unwell, physically deteriorating. Someone who might, under enough pressure, do something irreversible. What he was actually doing, according to the toxicology that would eventually confirm it, was poisoning her. Ethylene glycol, the primary ingredient in antifreeze, administered in doses over several days. Not a single large quantity. Small amounts. Worked into something she would eat or drink without noticing, metabolizing slowly, attacking her kidneys, producing weakness and confusion and the appearance of illness. By December 3, 1998, Julie Jensen could barely respond. Mark would tell detectives she had asked him not to call for help. He said he had honored that request. He watched her deteriorate through the night. And that morning, he called 911. He later told police, "I just watched it happen." The picture that investigators assembled from the inside was methodical in a way that went beyond any single act. The affair that he was protecting by removing his wife from the equation. The emails to Kelly Labonte promising a future together. The datebook entries. The computer searches he conducted late at night and in the early morning hours, when Julie would have been asleep, outside any normal usage pattern for a family machine. The explicit conversation with Ed Klug about poison websites. The antidepressant prescription arranged just before the end. The harassment campaign that may have been designed from the beginning to construct a picture of an unstable woman. Not rage, not impulse. A plan, assembled over months, by a man who believed he was going to get away with it. The first autopsy came back inconclusive. No cause of death. No manner of death. A medical examiner who couldn't determine what had killed a 40-year-old woman found dead in her bed. For a brief window, Julie Jensen's death existed in the worst possible space, suspicious enough to trouble the people who had looked at her, not definable enough to do anything about. What changed that was a second look at something investigators almost didn't test for. The day after Julie died, Detective Ratsburg received the sealed envelope from Ted Watched. He read the letter. The investigation shifted. The family's desktop computer was seized. The search history showed searches for poisoning methods, toxins, ethylene glycol, antifreeze, assisted suicide, medical conditions involving low pulse and low blood pressure. The searches were not casual or scattered. They occurred outside normal working hours, in the late night and early morning, over a period of months leading up to Julie's death. The day before Julie died, someone on that computer had searched for conditions consistent with the exact symptoms she was displaying. She was dead before noon the following morning. The initial toxicology screen had returned clean, but investigators, now pointed in a clear direction by the letter and the computer, ordered secondary blood testing. The forensic toxicologist's findings were unambiguous. Ethylene glycol in Julie's blood, stomach, and urine. And critically, not in a quantity consistent with self-administration. If Julie had poisoned herself, she would have taken a large dose, leaving high concentrations throughout her system. Instead, the distribution was consistent with small amounts administered over several days without her knowledge. It was the toxicological signature of someone being slowly, systematically dosed. The medical examiner ruled the manner of death a homicide. Prosecutors further alleged that in Julie's final hours, when her body was failing and she could no longer resist, Mark had pressed her face into a pillow. The damaged nose that had troubled Detective Jambois at the scene. The arm twisted at that unusual angle. Consistent, the prosecution argued, with a woman who had been suffocated. Jailhouse informant Aaron Dillard would later testify that Jensen told him directly he had pressed his wife's face into a pillow until she stopped breathing. Mark Jensen was initially questioned and released. Weeks after Julie's death, Kelly Labonte, his affair partner, moved into the Jensen family home, into the house where Julie had died, where David and Douglas were still living. Mark married her. They had a child together. He started a construction company. He built a new life with a speed that investigators noted. When detectives brought Mark in for a formal interview 4 months after Julie's death and confronted him about their findings, he insisted Labonte was just a friend. What he did not know, at that point, was that Julie's letter existed. Investigators made a decision. They handed Mark the letter and left him alone in the room with it. He had not known it was coming. He had not known she had written it. He sat in that room and read his dead wife's words and understood, for the first time, what she had done. He was arrested on March 20th, 2002, more than 3 years after Julie died, and charged with first-degree intentional homicide. The legal battle over the letter began almost immediately. Mark Jensen's defense made the argument that would delay justice for years. Under the Sixth Amendment, a defendant has the right to confront the witnesses against them. Julie Jensen was dead. She could not be cross-examined. Her letter, addressed to the police, written while she was afraid and documenting her fear, amounted to testimony she could never be held accountable for in open court. It was a constitutional argument that the Wisconsin courts took seriously. The case was delayed for years while it worked its way through the system. The Wisconsin Supreme Court ultimately ruled in 2007 that the letter could be used at trial. But the fight over it wasn't over. Not remotely. The injustice in this case was never that the Constitution protected Mark Jensen's rights. It was that Julie Jensen spent the final weeks of her life documenting her fears because she believed that might be the only way anyone would believe her. She couldn't ask police to arrest someone over a feeling. All she could do was leave a record and hope someone would read it if the worst happened. In the end, the letter wasn't the case. It was the beginning of it. Mark Jensen entered a plea of not guilty. He maintained his innocence. He has maintained it for more than 2 decades, through 2 criminal trials, multiple appeals, a federal court ruling in his favor, and a second unanimous jury verdict against him. He has been in custody since July 2007, when the first trial date was finally set and his bail was revoked. The first trial began on January 3, 2008, in Walworth County, moved from Kenosha because of the intensity of the media coverage. It ran for more than a month. The jury heard Julie's letter read aloud in open court. They heard the toxicology, the computer searches, the Ed Klug testimony, the affair with Kelly Labonte. They deliberated for 30 hours. On February 21, 2008, they found Mark Jensen guilty of first-degree intentional homicide. Judge Bruce Schroeder sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. A juror later told CNN that the letter had served as a roadmap to the murderer. Julie's 4 brothers stood outside the courthouse and thanked the jurors, the investigators, and the witnesses who had come forward. Jensen appealed on Sixth Amendment grounds. After years of proceedings at the Wisconsin appellate level, a federal court overturned the conviction in 2016 on the grounds that admitting Julie's letter had violated his right to confront witnesses against him. The Wisconsin Supreme Court ordered a new trial in 2021 with the letter and voicemails excluded. A Kenosha County judge vacated the conviction in April 2021. Jensen was held on $1.2 million bail. The retrial began on January 9, 2023, before Kenosha County Circuit Court Judge Anthony Milisauskas. Without the letter, without the voicemails, prosecutors built their case from the computer searches, the Ed Klug testimony, Aaron Dillard's account of the pillow, the emails to Kelly Labonte, now Kelly Brooks, having divorced Jensen, and the toxicology. The defense, again, argued suicide. Dr. Lindsay Thomas testified for the defense that Julie's death was most likely self-inflicted. The jury deliberated for more than 6 hours. On February 1, 2023, they came back with the same verdict: guilty. On April 14, 2023, Judge Milisauskas sentenced Mark Jensen to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the second time. Jensen told reporters after the verdict he intended to appeal again. He is currently incarcerated at Oshkosh Correctional Institute in Wisconsin. The second conviction matters more than the first, in a specific way that's worth holding on to. The first conviction was built around a letter so powerful that a juror compared it to a road map. When that conviction was overturned, it was easy to read it as a story about a woman whose voice had been taken from her twice. First by her husband, then by the courts. The second conviction rewrites that reading. A jury heard the case without Julie's letter, without her voicemail, without the most emotionally devastating piece of evidence available, and they reached the same conclusion in a day. What that says is that Julie Jensen was not protected only by the letter she wrote. She was protected by the evidence she helped create, by photographing the computer screen, by documenting the datebook, by talking to Cosman, by doing everything that a woman with limited options and unlimited clarity could do to make the truth survivable without her. The letter could not be used in the end. The truth underneath it could. On February 1, 2023, Larry and Paul Griffin stood outside the Kenosha County Courthouse holding a book of photographs. Julie in life. Laughing, present. The woman she was before any of this became the story people told about her. Larry spoke to reporters not about the verdict, but about who his sister was. She was 40 years old with a career she had set aside to be fully present for 2 boys she described as everything to her. She had a mind that held a Series 7 financial license and the emotional clarity to understand exactly what was happening to her in those final weeks. and to act on that understanding with the limited tools she had available. David and Douglas Jensen lost their mother when they were young. They grew up shaped by what happened in that house in 1998 in ways nobody can fully account for. Whatever their lives look like now, they are the reason Julie wrote what she wrote at 7 o'clock in the morning on November 21st. What Julie Jensen left behind goes beyond the legal precedent. She demonstrated, with remarkable precision under impossible circumstances, what it looks like to document abuse before it becomes a crime scene. She named her fear. She described what she saw. She handed it to people she trusted with instructions so clear they were followed to the letter. The tragedy is that none of it saved her. The legacy is that it convicted him. She was right about what was happening to her. She was right about who was doing it. She left a roadmap. It took a long time, but people followed it. If you found this story touching, please consider sharing it with someone else. And if you haven't already, subscribe. It helps us continue telling the stories that deserve to be remembered, not for the crimes that ended them, but for the lives that came before. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.